criminal. There are crimes that fade into paper archives and police storerooms, and then there are those that refuse to loosen their grip on the imagination. Crimes that linger in the mind like a stubborn echo, resurfacing years later with the same uneasy clarity. And the Zodiac murders belong firmly in the latter category, not merely because of their brutality, but because of the peculiar theatre that accompanied them. The letters, the ciphers, the taunts, and the unsettling sense that whoever orchestrated them derived as much pleasure from manipulation as from violence. I first came to the case not through any academic interest, but through the peculiar magnetism that certain unsolved crimes possess. The slow and creeping fascination which begins with a newspaper clipping or a passing mention and gradually develops into a quiet obsession. And the deeper one looks into the Zodiac case, the more it becomes apparent that this was not simply a series of murders, but a performance designed to outlast its perpetrator. The story begins in Northern California in the late 1960s, a time and place often remembered for counterculture optimism, psychedelic music, and the illusion of social transformation. Yet beneath that colourful veneer, there existed the same capacity for cruelty and predation that has always shadowed human society. And on the night of December 20th, 1968, that shadow emerged with terrifying clarity on a remote road near Vallejo, known as Lake Herman Road. A young couple, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, both teenagers with ordinary lives and unremarkable routines, parked their car in a secluded turnout, a common enough activity for young couples seeking privacy, and it was there that they were approached by an unknown individual who would later claim responsibility for their deaths. The details of the attack were simple and chilling in their efficiency. Faraday was shot at close range inside the car, and Jensen, attempting to flee, was pursued and shot multiple times in the back. Collapsing onto the gravel in the darkness, her body discovered hours later by passing motorists who could not have imagined that they were stumbling upon the beginning of one of the most infamous murder series in American history. At the time, the killings were treated as a tragic but isolated event, the sort of crime that occasionally surfaces in rural areas, senseless and brutal, yet not obviously part of any broader pattern. And for several months, there was little to connect the case to anything larger, until July 4th, 1969, when another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, parked in a lover's lane at Blue Rock Springs Park, also near Vallejo, and were approached by a car that pulled in behind them. The driver exited his vehicle and approached the passenger side of Ferrin's car with a flashlight, which he used to illuminate the interior before opening fire with a 9mm handgun, striking both victims multiple times. Mageau survived despite severe injuries, while Ferrin died shortly after arriving at the hospital, and within minutes of the shooting, a call was placed to the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone less than a mile from the scene. The caller spoke calmly and without visible urgency, reporting the shooting and then adding, almost as an afterthought, that he was also responsible for the murders of the 2 teenagers on Lake Herman Road months earlier, delivering this information with a tone that suggested not remorse but ownership, as though he were cataloguing achievements rather than confessing to atrocities. The connection between the two crimes transformed what had been isolated incidents into something far more disturbing, and the case might have proceeded along the usual investigative lines had it not been for the letters that began arriving at local newspapers later that month. On August 1st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters were received by the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, each containing a portion of a cipher composed of strange symbols and characters, along with a demand that the newspapers print the cipher on their front pages or risk further killings. The letters included details about the Blue Rock Springs attack that had not been released to the public, lending credibility to the author's claim that he was indeed the killer, and each letter was signed with a peculiar symbol resembling a crosshair within a circle, a mark that would become synonymous with the case, and which the writer soon began using as a signature. He did not initially refer to himself by any particular name, but the tone of the letters was unmistakably theatrical, combining boasts, threats, and a curious desire for recognition, as though the murders themselves were insufficient without an audience to witness and acknowledge them. The cipher was eventually solved not by professional cryptographers, but by a schoolteacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Harden, who painstakingly analyzed the symbols and uncovered a message that offered insight into the writer's mindset rather than his identity. The decoded text spoke of killing as a form of pleasure and of collecting slaves for the afterlife, a notion both grotesque and revealing, suggesting that the perpetrator viewed his victims not as individuals but as possessions, trophies to be carried into whatever fantasy he constructed beyond death. The message ended abruptly, offering no name and no clear clues as to the author's identity. Yet its publication confirmed beyond reasonable doubt that the killer sought attention as much as he sought blood. And from that moment onward, the case became a macabre dialogue between murderer, media, and law enforcement. What followed over the next several months was a sequence of attacks and communications that blurred the line between criminal investigation and public spectacle, each new development accompanied by fresh letters, additional ciphers, and increasingly elaborate threats. On September 27th, 1969, a young couple named Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking beside Lake Berryessa when they were approached by a man wearing a dark hooded costume emblazoned with the same crosshair symbol that had appeared in the letters. He carried a handgun and claimed to be an escaped convict seeking money and a car. Yet after binding the couple with pre-cut lengths of clothesline, he produced a knife and began stabbing them repeatedly, inflicting wounds that were both methodical and savage. Shepard succumbed to her injuries 2 days later, while Hartnell survived, providing investigators with one of the few detailed eyewitness accounts of the attacker, describing him as deliberate and oddly conversational, his voice calm even as he carried out the assault. Before leaving the scene, the assailant walked back to the victim's car and used a black felt-tip pen to write a message on the door, listing the dates of previous attacks along with the symbol that had already become his signature, an act that transformed the crime scene into yet another stage upon which he could display his authorship. The escalation continued on October 11th, 1969, in San Francisco, where a taxi driver named Paul Stein picked up a passenger who directed him to the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood, and upon arrival, the passenger shot Stein in the head at close range, then calmly exited the cab and removed a portion of the victim's shirt before walking away into the night. Several teenagers in a nearby house witnessed part of the incident and alerted police, providing a description that led to an initial search for a black suspect due to a miscommunication in dispatch. A tragic error that may have allowed the actual perpetrator to evade immediate capture. In the days that followed, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, this time containing a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt as proof of responsibility, along with further taunts directed at police and the public. It was in this correspondence that the writer first referred to himself explicitly as Zodiac, a name that would soon eclipse all others associated with the case and cement his place in the darker corners of modern folklore. By the end of 1969, the Zodiac had established himself not merely as a murderer, but as a presence, a figure who seemed to hover at the edges of public consciousness, capable of appearing and disappearing at will, communicating through cryptic messages and carefully timed letters, and the sense of unpredictability that surrounded him was perhaps his most potent weapon, for it ensured that no one could be certain where or when he might strike next. Police departments across Northern California coordinated their efforts, comparing notes, analyzing handwriting, and pursuing countless leads. Yet the killer remained elusive, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and a trail of words that offered more provocation than clarity. What makes the Zodiac case particularly unsettling is not simply the number of victims, which remains relatively small compared to other serial murder investigations, but the manner in which the killer inserted himself into the narrative, shaping public perception and controlling the flow of information with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive violence. Each letter served not only as a confession, but as a performance, an opportunity to assert dominance over both investigators and the wider public. And in doing so, he transformed his crimes into something that transcended the immediate horror of the acts themselves, embedding them within a larger story that continues to be told and retold decades later. And it is perhaps that enduring quality which makes the Zodiac case so difficult to abandon, for even now, long after the original investigators have retired or passed away, the questions remain stubbornly unanswered, lingering in police files, amateur investigations, and the collective imagination, waiting for a resolution that may never come, yet refusing to fade into obscurity. By the end of 1969, Northern California was gripped by a peculiar form of dread that did not resemble the panic typically associated with serial violence, because this was not a killer who left a clear pattern or geographic boundary, nor one who struck with predictable frequency, but rather an individual who appeared to choose his moments carefully, emerging without warning and then retreating into silence, leaving behind only letters that were as calculated as they were unsettling. The Zodiac's correspondence became almost as significant as the murders themselves, each envelope arriving like a deliberate intrusion into everyday life, reminding the public that whoever had committed those crimes was still out there, still watching, and still capable of inserting himself into the narrative whenever he chose. These letters varied in tone, sometimes grandiose, sometimes oddly mundane, yet always tinged with a sense of superiority, as though the writer considered himself not merely a criminal, but a participant in some elaborate intellectual game. One of the most notable communications arrived in November 1969 and contained a new cipher, far longer and more complex than the previous one, composed of 340 characters arranged in a grid that would later be referred to simply as the Zult 340. Unlike the earlier cipher, this one resisted immediate solution, baffling both professional and amateur codebreakers for decades, and its apparent impenetrability only added to the mystique surrounding the killer. In the accompanying letter, the writer mocked police efforts and hinted at future acts of violence, suggesting that he would target school buses and shoot children as they disembarked, a threat that caused widespread alarm despite never being carried out. Schools implemented safety measures. Parents grew increasingly anxious, and the notion that an unseen figure might be watching from a distance became a quiet but persistent fear in communities across the region. The investigation into the Zodiac killings was complicated from the outset by jurisdictional boundaries, as the crimes spanned multiple counties and involved various law enforcement agencies that did not always communicate seamlessly. Vallejo Police Department handled the early cases. Napa County authorities investigated the Lake Berryessa attack, and the San Francisco Police Department took the lead following the murder of Paul Stein, each agency pursuing its own leads while attempting to coordinate with the others. This fragmentation created inevitable gaps, and although there were periodic joint task forces and shared briefings, the lack of a single unified command structure sometimes hindered the flow of information. Detectives worked tirelessly, interviewing witnesses, analyzing ballistic evidence, and reviewing thousands of tips from the public. Yet the sheer volume of data often proved overwhelming, and the killer's deliberate use of misleading or ambiguous information only added to the confusion. Among the many pieces of physical evidence collected were fingerprints lifted from the taxi in which Paul Stein had been killed, along with handwriting samples from the letters and envelopes sent to newspapers and police. Handwriting experts compared these samples to those of various suspects, searching for distinctive patterns or similarities, yet such analyses were inherently subjective and rarely conclusive. Ballistic tests linked the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs shootings through shell casings and bullet markings, confirming that the same weapon had been used in both incidents, but the gun itself was never recovered, leaving investigators with little more than partial impressions and educated guesses. The hooded costume described by Brian Hartnell at Lake Berryessa was never found, nor were any of the knives or firearms definitively tied to a suspect, and as months turned into years, the physical trail grew colder. The Zodiac himself continued to write, sometimes claiming responsibility for additional murders that could not be conclusively linked to him, other times offering cryptic references that may have been genuine confessions or simply attempts to inflate his notoriety. In one letter, he claimed to have killed as many as 37 people, a figure widely regarded as exaggerated, yet the possibility that some victims remained unidentified or unconnected could never be entirely dismissed. He sent greeting cards, postcards, and lengthy handwritten notes, occasionally including small fragments of evidence, such as pieces of Paul Stein's shirt, which served to confirm that at least some of the correspondence was authentic. The tone of these communications fluctuated between playful mockery and chilling menace, creating a sense that the writer was acutely aware of his audience and took pleasure in maintaining control over their reactions. Suspects emerged and faded with unsettling regularity, each new name generating brief surges of hope or speculation before ultimately collapsing under the weight of insufficient evidence. One of the most frequently discussed figures was Arthur Lee Allen, a former schoolteacher with a criminal history and an unsettling array of circumstantial connections to the case. Allen owned a watch bearing the Zodiac brand and symbol, had been accused of inappropriate behavior toward children, and was known to frequent areas near some of the crime scenes. He was questioned by police multiple times and subjected to searches of his home and property, yet no definitive physical evidence ever tied him to the murders or the letters, and handwriting analyses failed to produce a match. Despite this, Allen remained a prominent suspect in the public imagination, particularly after his name surfaced in various books and documentaries, illustrating how the absence of closure can encourage speculation to fill the void left by unanswered questions. Another line of inquiry involved examining individuals with military or technical backgrounds, given the killer's apparent familiarity with firearms, ciphers, and possibly even surveillance or evasion techniques. Some investigators theorized that the Zodiac may have served in the armed forces or possessed training that enabled him to operate with a level of discipline and planning uncommon among impulsive offenders. Yet such profiles, while intriguing, often proved too broad to be practically useful, encompassing a vast number of potential suspects without narrowing the field in any meaningful way. The letters themselves, though rich in tone and personality, offered few concrete clues, and the killer's deliberate use of disguise, both literal and metaphorical, made it difficult to separate genuine information from calculated misdirection. The cultural impact of the Zodiac case grew steadily throughout the 1970s, fueled by media coverage, books, and the persistent absence of resolution. The killer's symbol appeared on posters and in newspapers. His letters were analyzed and reprinted, and his name entered the lexicon as shorthand for an elusive and taunting criminal mind. Unlike many serial killers whose identities are eventually revealed, allowing society to confine them within the boundaries of biography and motive, the Zodiac remained faceless, a figure defined more by actions and words than by any confirmed personal history. This anonymity granted him a peculiar form of longevity, ensuring that his story would continue to evolve long after the original crimes had ceased. Investigators, both official and amateur, revisited the case repeatedly over the decades, applying new forensic techniques and re-examining old evidence in the hope that something might have been overlooked. Advances in DNA analysis offered occasional glimmers of possibility, particularly with regard to saliva traces on stamps and envelopes from the letters. Yet the results were often inconclusive or insufficient to identify a specific individual. Partial profiles could sometimes be extracted, but without a definitive match in existing databases, they remained fragments rather than solutions. Each technological breakthrough seemed to promise closure, only to deliver further ambiguity, reinforcing the sense that the Zodiac had constructed his crimes with an awareness of how to obscure his identity. What lingers most when examining this period is the unsettling interplay between visibility and invisibility that defined the Zodiac's presence. He was at once everywhere and nowhere, his words appearing in print, his symbol recognized across the country. Yet his face and name remained unknown, hidden behind layers of deliberate obfuscation. This duality created a peculiar psychological effect, transforming him from a mere criminal into something closer to an urban myth, a figure whose reality was unquestioned, yet whose identity remained perpetually out of reach. And as the years progressed without a definitive arrest, that sense of unresolved tension only deepened, ensuring that the Zodiac would remain not merely a case file, but a lingering question mark in the history of American crime.